What if I told you that some of the most beloved American family suppers, once celebrated in every kitchen, have quietly vanished from our tables? Suppers that carried the warmth of togetherness, the smell of comfort, and the charm of an era when Betty Crocker was the queen of home cooking. Today, they're not just forgotten recipes, they're memories locked in old cookbooks, waiting to be rediscovered. Back in the mid-20th century, Betty Crocker didn't just teach families how to cook, she defined what dinner meant in America. Her recipes weren't just instructions on paper, they were lifelines for busy parents, guiding them through weeknights when food was more than fuel, it was family. Supper was the heart of the home, the place where laughter, storytelling, and even the day's worries were shared over simple but heartfelt meals. But somewhere along the way, fast food, frozen dinners, and quick fixes began to replace the slow, thoughtful suppers that once filled American kitchens. Dishes that brought comfort during the Great Depression, joy in the post-war years, and pride in family tradition slowly faded into obscurity. Today, many of us haven't even heard of them. That's why in this video, we're bringing those suppers back to life. From quirky casseroles to hearty one-dish meals, these recipes tell the story of how America once ate and how food shaped the way families connected. Some may surprise you, some may feel nostalgic, and others might just inspire you to bring them back to your own table. So, let's open the pages of history and step back into Betty Crocker's kitchen, where every dish had a story and every supper meant something more.
Tuna noodle casserole. If there's one supper that truly defined mid-century American kitchens, it has to be the tuna noodle casserole. Simple, comforting, and incredibly budget-friendly, this dish was the weeknight hero for countless families who trusted Betty Crocker to stretch $1 without sacrificing flavor. At its heart, tuna noodle casserole was born out of necessity. After World War II, canned goods became staples in nearly every pantry. Tuna, in particular, was affordable, widely available, and packed with protein. Paired with egg noodles, a cheap and filling base, this casserole quickly became a go-to dinner option. The secret binding ingredient? Cream of mushroom soup. Betty Crocker embraced the convenience of canned soups, which made the dish creamy, hearty, and nearly foolproof. Add in a sprinkle of peas for color, sometimes a handful of cheese for richness, and top it all off with crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs for that irresistible golden crunch. It wasn't fancy, but it was dependable, exactly what families needed during the hustle of the 1950s and 60s. But this wasn't just about food. For mothers balancing work, children, and house duties, tuna noodle casserole was a lifesaver. It could be prepared quickly, baked in one dish, and served to the whole family without fuss. Around countless dinner tables, it carried the taste of warmth, security, and togetherness. Today, the tuna noodle casserole has mostly disappeared, replaced by trendier meals and fresher ingredients. But for those who grew up with it, just the thought of that creamy, crunchy bite can bring back memories of linoleum kitchens, clinking forks, and the steady voice of Betty Crocker promising that supper would always be something to look forward to. Chicken a la king. There was a time when chicken a la king felt like the height of elegance in an American home. And thanks to Betty Crocker, this creamy, savory dish became a weeknight star, served not in fancy restaurants, but right at the family dinner table. The origins of chicken a la king stretch back to the late 19th century, but it was Betty Crocker who truly brought it into everyday kitchens. By the 1950s and 60s, her cookbooks and meal planners turned this once luxurious recipe into a practical supper for middle-class families. The dish called for chunks of cooked chicken bathed in a rich, velvety sauce of butter, flour, milk, and a touch of sherry or chicken stock. To this creamy base, mushrooms and green peppers added both flavor and color. But the presentation is what made it unforgettable. Instead of simply ladling it over rice or noodles, Betty encouraged home cooks to serve chicken a la king on toast points, puff pastry shells, or even over biscuits, transforming an ordinary evening meal into something that felt indulgent. For children, it was the kind of dinner that felt fancy, while for parents, it was a way to stretch leftover chicken into a dish that looked and tasted special. This supper also reflected the cultural mood of post-war America. Families longed for comfort but still wanted a touch of sophistication. Chicken a la king delivered exactly that, creamy, hearty, but polished enough to impress guests or mark a small celebration. Over time, though, the dish faded. The rise of fast food and changing tastes pushed it aside, leaving it tucked away in old cookbooks. But for those who remember, chicken a la king remains a symbol of the era when Betty Crocker taught America that supper could be both simple and elegant. Hamburger pie. Before fast food chains turned hamburgers into a quick bite, Betty Crocker was teaching families how to turn ground beef into something heartier, something that could feed a whole household. Enter the hamburger pie, a forgotten supper that once ruled American dinner tables. This dish was pure 1950s ingenuity. Ground beef was cheap, versatile, and filling, making it a staple in nearly every kitchen. But instead of frying up simple patties, Betty Crocker turned it into a casserole-style pie. The base was seasoned hamburger meat, often mixed with onions, a can of tomatoes, or even a dash of Worcestershire sauce for flavor. On top came a layer of mashed potatoes, spread like frosting across the beefy filling, and baked until golden brown. Sometimes families swapped the potatoes for biscuit dough or cornbread batter, giving the pie a crusty, comforting finish. For families of the post-war years, hamburger pie represented practicality and pride. It stretched a pound of beef into a full meal, was easy enough for busy moms to make, and hearty enough to satisfy hungry kids after a long day of school or chores. Around the table, it wasn't just dinner, it was a symbol of resourcefulness, proving that even the most ordinary ingredients could be transformed into something memorable. By the 1970s, though, hamburger pie began fading from popularity. Processed foods and frozen dinners stole the spotlight, and the rustic simplicity of casseroles no longer fit the modern appetite. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone making it outside of vintage cookbooks or family traditions. Yet for those who remember, hamburger pie was more than just beef and potatoes, it was the taste of an America that believed supper should be filling, comforting, and shared with the people who mattered most. Deviled ham loaf. Long before deli counters made sandwiches effortless, Betty Crocker popularized a supper dish that turned leftover ham into something new and exciting, the deviled ham loaf. It was bold, flavorful, and a little quirky, just the kind of recipe that made weeknights special. The foundation was simple. Leftover baked ham, often ground or finely chopped, was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and milk to hold it all together. But what gave this dish its deviled edge was the seasoning. A spoonful of mustard, a dash of cayenne, and sometimes even a splash of vinegar added a punchy tang that set it apart from traditional meatloaf. Once shaped into a loaf and baked, it emerged golden brown, ready to be sliced and served alongside mashed potatoes or green beans. For many mid-century families, deviled ham loaf was more than just a way to repurpose leftovers, it was a money saver. During the 1940s and 50s, stretching a Sunday ham into multiple meals was a mark of a clever cook. Betty Crocker offered this recipe as proof that frugality didn't have to mean blandness. Families could enjoy the richness of ham with a zesty kick, turning an ordinary weeknight supper into something that felt fresh and different. Kids often remember the smell wafting from the oven, while parents appreciated its convenience. It could be mixed up quickly, baked in a single dish, and served hot or cold. In fact, leftover slices made excellent sandwiches for the next day's lunchboxes. Over time, however, deviled ham loaf faded into obscurity, overshadowed by simpler dinners and pre-packaged meats. Today, it exists mostly as a culinary memory, a dish that spoke to an era when resourcefulness, flavor, and a little creativity could make even humble leftovers shine. Salmon Wiggle. With a name as playful as Salmon Wiggle, this Betty Crocker classic was once a weeknight staple that blended comfort with creativity. Today, it's nearly forgotten, but in mid-20th century kitchens, it was a clever way to stretch simple pantry ingredients into a satisfying supper. The base of Salmon Wiggle was canned salmon, affordable, protein-packed, and a reliable standby when fresh fish was out of reach. To this, Betty Crocker added a creamy white sauce, often enriched with milk and butter, and stirred in peas for both sweetness and color. The mixture was then poured over toast, rice, or noodles, where it lived up to its charming name, a wiggly, creamy dish that felt both filling and fun. For families in the 1940s and 50s, this recipe was more than convenience, it was reassurance. During times of rationing and tight budgets, canned salmon provided nourishment without breaking the bank. Children loved its silly name, while parents appreciated how quickly it could be pulled together after a long day. Supper didn't need to be extravagant, it just needed to bring comfort, and Salmon Wiggle delivered exactly that. The dish also reflected Betty Crocker's genius, teaching home cooks how to elevate humble ingredients with just a few pantry staples. By turning canned fish into something warm and inviting, she gave families a supper that felt wholesome and homemade, even in lean times. Over the decades, tastes shifted. Fresh salmon became more common, casseroles lost their shine, and Salmon Wiggle quietly disappeared from dinner tables. But for those who remember, the creamy texture, the pop of peas, and the gentle richness of canned salmon were reminders of a time when food didn't need to be fancy to feel special, it just needed to be shared. Chop suey hot dish. Once upon a time, Betty Crocker invited America to taste the world without ever leaving the kitchen. One of her most beloved mid-century experiments was the chop suey hot dish, a supper that blended Chinese-American flavors with the heartiness of a casserole. Today, it's nearly forgotten, but back then, it felt adventurous and comforting all at once. At its core, this dish began with ground beef or pork, browned with onions and celery for a savory base. Then came the exotic touch, canned bean sprouts, water chestnuts, and soy sauce, ingredients that many American families first encountered through Betty Crocker's recipes. Everything was simmered together in a light, savory sauce, then baked with rice or noodles to transform it into a hearty one-dish meal. For families of the 1950s and 60s, chop suey hot dish represented something exciting. It was the era of curiosity, when television, magazines, and cookbooks introduced American households to dishes inspired by immigrant communities. Betty Crocker knew how to make these flavors approachable, weaving them into the familiar casserole format that Midwestern families especially loved. Children remember the crunch of water chestnuts, while parents appreciated how it stretched a little meat into a meal big enough to feed everyone. And while it wasn't authentic Chinese cuisine, it was a reflection of how American kitchens borrowed flavors from abroad and made them their own. Over time, as international dining became more accessible, dishes like chop suey hot dish faded into memory. What once felt daring eventually seemed old-fashioned, replaced by takeout and modern recipes. Yet, for those who grew up with it, this casserole holds the taste of an America eager to experiment while never straying too far from the comfort of home. Turkey tetrazzini. Once considered the perfect way to use up Thanksgiving leftovers, turkey tetrazzini was one of Betty Crocker's most beloved post-holiday suppers. Creamy, filling, and endlessly adaptable, it turned leftover turkey into a dish that families looked forward to almost as much as the holiday feast itself. The recipe traced its roots back to early 20th century restaurant fare, but Betty Crocker helped make it a household classic. The dish began with spaghetti or egg noodles, tossed in a velvety sauce of butter, flour, milk, and a sprinkle of Parmesan or cheddar cheese. To that, chopped turkey and mushrooms were added, creating a rich, savory base. Sometimes a splash of sherry or chicken broth gave it depth, while peas or pimentos added color. Finally, it was baked until golden, bubbling, and irresistibly fragrant. For many mid-century families, turkey tetrazzini wasn't just about saving money, it was about extending the warmth of the holidays. After the big feast, leftovers often felt like a chore, but this dish transformed them into something new and special. Around the dinner table, it was a reminder that even after the celebration ended, there was still comfort and joy in sharing a hearty meal together. Children loved the creamy noodles, parents loved the practicality, and Betty Crocker's guidance ensured it came out right every time. It was a recipe that carried families through the chilly days after Thanksgiving, when the house was still filled with the echoes of laughter and celebration. Over time, turkey tetrazzini faded as quick-fix meals and store-bought options replaced elaborate leftovers. But for those who remember, the bubbling casserole dish carried not just flavor, but the spirit of family tradition, making it one of the most nostalgic suppers of all. Spanish rice supper. Back when supper meant something hearty and dependable, Betty Crocker gave families a dish with just the right touch of flair: Spanish rice supper. It wasn't authentic Spanish cuisine, of course, but rather a comforting Americanized version that turned simple pantry staples into a flavorful one-dish meal. The heart of the recipe was rice, simmered until tender in a tomato-based sauce. Ground beef or sometimes sausage added richness, while green peppers, onions, and a pinch of chili powder brought just enough spice to make the dish feel different from ordinary casseroles. Some families sprinkled cheese over the top before baking, while others kept it simple, just rice, beef, and tomatoes, bubbling together in a skillet or casserole dish. For mid-century households, Spanish rice supper carried both practicality and novelty. Rice was cheap, canned tomatoes were plentiful, and ground beef stretched far enough to feed a crowd. Yet the dish had just enough kick to feel like something new in a time when American dinners leaned heavily on meat and potatoes. For kids, it was fun, colorful, and filling. For parents, it was quick, affordable, and foolproof under Betty Crocker's careful instructions. This dish also reflected the growing influence of Latin-inspired flavors in American kitchens. While far from authentic, it showed how Betty Crocker introduced families to ingredients and seasonings they might never have tried otherwise. In many ways, it was the bridge between classic American comfort food and the evolving tastes of a more diverse country. Over time, Spanish rice supper disappeared from dinner tables, replaced by tacos, enchiladas, and more authentic Latin dishes that became mainstream. Yet for those who remember, this casserole holds the taste of a simpler era when just rice, beef, and tomatoes could turn an ordinary evening into something memorable. Liver and onions supper. Once considered a wholesome, everyday dinner, liver and onions was a Betty Crocker staple that reflected the values of thrift, nutrition, and tradition. Today, many wrinkle their noses at the thought, but for mid-century families, this dish was both practical and deeply familiar. Beef liver was inexpensive, widely available, and packed with iron and vitamins, qualities that appeal to homemakers striving to keep their families healthy on a budget. Betty Crocker's version kept things straightforward: slices of liver dredged lightly in flour, pan-fried until browned, and smothered with golden, caramelized onions. Sometimes a splash of gravy or stock was added, turning the dish into a hearty supper when served with mashed potatoes or rice. For children, the taste was often acquired, but parents saw it as a nutritional powerhouse. Betty Crocker's guidance made the process approachable, giving families confidence in cooking an ingredient that might otherwise feel intimidating. Around countless dinner tables, liver and onions became a reminder that frugality and nourishment went hand in hand. Beyond the nutrition, though, this dish carried a sense of old-fashioned tradition. For many families, it was a recipe passed down from grandparents who grew up in harder times, when wasting food wasn't an option. Serving liver wasn't just about saving money, it was about honoring the resourcefulness of earlier generations. As tastes changed in the 1970s and beyond, liver and onions slipped out of favor. Families turned to convenience foods and milder flavors, leaving this once common supper behind. Yet for those who remember, the sizzling sound of liver hitting the pan and the sweet aroma of onions browning in butter bring back memories of kitchens where practicality and tradition always had a place. Ham and potato scallop. Few suppers captured the spirit of comfort and economy quite like ham and potato scallop. Guided by Betty Crocker's recipes, this dish became a reliable favorite in mid-century homes, turning leftover ham into a creamy, bubbling casserole that warmed both the kitchen and the heart. The base was simple: thin slices of potatoes layered in a casserole dish, sprinkled with chopped ham, and bathed in a homemade white sauce of butter, flour, and milk. Sometimes onions were tucked between the layers for extra flavor, and a dusting of cheese or breadcrumbs on top gave the dish a golden finish. Slowly baked until tender, the result was a rich, hearty meal that filled the house with an aroma as comforting as the dish itself. For many families, ham and potato scallop wasn't just about taste, it was about stretching resources. Leftover ham from Sunday dinners or holiday feasts could be reinvented into something that felt entirely new. Betty Crocker's promise was that even humble ingredients, when combined thoughtfully, could become suppers worth remembering. Children recall the bubbling sound as the casserole came out of the oven, while parents appreciated how the dish balanced frugality with satisfaction. Served alongside a simple green salad or bread, it provided everything a family needed for a hearty evening meal. Over time, dishes like ham and potato scallop gave way to quicker fixes: boxed potatoes, microwave meals, and pre-made casseroles. Yet, for those who grew up in kitchens where this supper was served, the memory is unforgettable. It's the taste of togetherness, of using what you had, and of sitting down to a meal that was both practical and deeply comforting. Meatball supper casserole. Long before frozen meatballs became a grocery store shortcut, Betty Crocker showed families how to make them from scratch and turn them into a hearty meatball supper casserole that was both filling and full of flavor. Today, it's almost forgotten, but in the 1950s and 60s, it was the kind of dish that brought families running to the table. The recipe started with homemade meatballs, usually a mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, milk, and seasonings. Once browned, they were nestled into a casserole dish with noodles or rice, then smothered in tomato sauce or sometimes a creamy mushroom sauce, depending on the family's taste. A sprinkling of cheese on top ensured a bubbling, golden finish once it came out of the oven. For busy parents, this dish was a lifesaver. It could be prepared ahead, baked in one pan, and served as a complete supper with little fuss. For kids, it was pure comfort: the savory meatballs, the tender pasta, and the gooey cheese made it a meal that felt special, even on an ordinary weeknight. What made this recipe shine was its flexibility. Betty Crocker encouraged families to adapt it to whatever they had on hand, different sauces, leftover vegetables, or even varying meats. It was proof that supper didn't need to be complicated to feel abundant and satisfying. As decades passed, meatball supper casserole faded from the spotlight, replaced by store-bought convenience foods and trendy pasta bakes. Yet for those who remember, this dish represents the heart of Betty Crocker's influence: simple ingredients, transformed into a meal that nourished both body and spirit. It wasn't just a casserole, it was a symbol of an era when gathering for supper was the highlight of the day. And there you have it, 12 suppers that once defined American kitchens, now nearly forgotten. Each one tells a story, not just of food, but of the families who gathered around the table. From bubbling casseroles to playful dishes with names like Salmon Wiggle, these weren't just recipes, they were traditions, moments of comfort, and little reminders that supper was about so much more than eating. Betty Crocker wasn't just teaching people how to cook, she was shaping the rhythm of everyday life. Her suppers brought families together after long days, gave parents a sense of pride, and gave children memories that still linger decades later. These dishes carried the flavors of resourcefulness, creativity, and love, values that defined a generation of home cooking. And while most of these recipes have disappeared from modern tables, they still hold power. Power to remind us of Sunday afternoons spent in warm kitchens, the sound of laughter bouncing off the walls, and the smell of casseroles drifting from the oven. They remind us of a time when meals weren't rushed, when sitting down to supper was a daily ritual that bound families together. Maybe some of these dishes made you smile with nostalgia, or maybe you're curious enough to bring one back into your own kitchen. Either way, remembering them is like opening a time capsule to an era when food was simple, yet meaningful. If you enjoyed this journey back into Betty Crocker's kitchen, make sure to subscribe for more stories about forgotten recipes, vintage traditions, and the flavors that once shaped America. And who knows? The next forgotten dish we uncover might just end up on your table again. Because sometimes, the best way to look forward is to taste the past.